For more on what is happening in Sudan, I'm joined by Alyona Synenko, regional spokesperson for the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you so much for being with us. First, I wanted to ask you about the report released by the ICRC on the catastrophic humanitarian situation. What are the main points to remember and recall from this report?
Well, I think that the main points and the disturbing trends that we have been seeing in the past 2 years is that the way this conflict has been fought is non-respectful of the norms of the international humanitarian law. And this is why we're seeing the absolutely devastating humanitarian consequences that you have just described, with millions of people uprooted from their homes, hundreds of thousands killed, women and children crossing the border, desperate, sleeping out in the open. A lot of these devastating consequences could have been avoided if the parties complied with their obligations under international humanitarian law.
Now, you mentioned the violation of humanitarian law. Can you give us some specific examples of what are these violations and how they contributed to making the crisis worse?
Well, we've been talking for several months now about some of the disturbing patterns that we have seen, for example, attacks against essential civilian infrastructure, because this is something that also contributes quite a lot to the population to the movement of civilian population, because it is, of course, the violence against civilians that has contributed to that, but it's also the fact that in many areas people do not have water, do not have hospitals, do not have any essential infrastructure, and those places have become just unlivable for the civilians. And this is why we're seeing people running, sometimes running in big numbers, in panic. And that leads to the skyrocketing of other humanitarian consequences. Families get separated, children get lost, people lose sight of each other. And today we're trying to find almost 8,000 of people who were reported to us as missing. And this is just the tip of the iceberg.
The report also points to sexual violence being used as a sort of weapon of war. How widespread is that in your findings?
What is one of the most disturbing things about the conflict in Sudan today is that the civilian infrastructure, hospitals, primary healthcare centers, have almost stopped functioning. We're talking about some 80% of health facilities that are no longer operational. And those health facilities are the ones who are supposed to be receiving victims of sexual violence, providing them with the first aid, with the medical and psychosocial support. And also it is thanks to these facilities that we would be able to tell the real scale of the problem. But today, this essential infrastructure is just not there, and large parts of the country are not even accessible for the humanitarian community, and that makes it extremely difficult for us to even give estimates about the numbers. But the accounts that we hear from women that cross the borders, who arrive at the facilities that we support in Chad, in South Sudan, are absolutely harrowing. And those are again flagrant examples of the non-respect of the international humanitarian law that we see in Sudan.
Another issue is the question of humanitarian funding. We've seen, of course, for example, the dismantling of USAID. What sort of impact has that had on your ability and other humanitarian organizations' ability to help in Sudan?
The competition for humanitarian funding we have been seeing in the past several years have been increasingly fierce, because there's just so many humanitarian emergencies today that are screaming for attention. And of course, these latest trends with the dramatic reduction in the humanitarian funding that is available. It is a very worrying development for us. We are yet to see the concrete outcome on our operations, on the humanitarian situation, but the outlook is dire. Because the humanitarian needs that we are seeing, they are not getting smaller, they are skyrocketing unless we have some very urgent measures and political will from the parties, from the international community to invest in the respect of the humanitarian law. We are going to see more and more of these humanitarian needs and more dire consequences. And with the humanitarian funds that are growing scarce, this paints a very disturbing picture for the future.
You mentioned the political aspect of this crisis. Now, the head of the ICRC delegation in Sudan said that the international community cannot turn away from Sudan, and he called for a concerted diplomatic and humanitarian effort. What exactly should and can the international community do to help Sudan?
Of course, the humanitarian effort alone will not be able to resolve and to bring the answer to this dire humanitarian situation that we are seeing today. No matter how much humanitarian assistance we deliver, we will never be able to replace the functional economy, to replace the commercial trucks that need to deliver goods, to supply the markets for people to be able to access food. So, of course, we need some stability. We need diplomatic efforts to have some diplomatic resolution in sight for this crisis that have now lasted for 2 years. And it's unimaginable to see how these 2 years have been for the people who live in Sudan. So we need diplomatic effort, and we need much needed peace, relief, respite for civilians who live in Sudan. And of course, we need also humanitarian assistance and humanitarian access to be able to deliver this relief. But this will only be possible if there is a real will to invest in the respect of the norms of the international humanitarian law.
Thank you very much for bringing some light to this really dire situation in Sudan, which is marking 2 years of that war. Alyona Synenko, thank you, the regional correspondent for the ICRC.